live.
Oh, I forgot my phone. Well, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Okay.
Because I don't have my phone
It's fine.
in front of me.
It's fine.
We're good to go, Betty.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our next line in our Lunch and Learn series through the Office of DEI. This is Sherry Gagnon. She's right here at Western in our Disability Services for Students. I'm going to allow her to tell you a little bit about herself. And we'll go ahead and get started. We'll ask questions at the end. There will certainly be a QR code so that you all can take the survey. And if anybody needs CEs or CEUs. This over here, just a FYI, this over here is I'm just asking a question about belonging here at the college. And so if you have a second afterwards, feel free to put up a Post-it note. Sherry, thank you for coming.
Hey, good. I guess it's not morning anymore. Good afternoon. So a little bit about me, my background. I have deaf parents. I have a deaf son. His deafness is not hereditary. My deafness is. Deafness comes in different forms and for different reasons. He actually was a drug baby, and he had all kinds of underdevelopments, and the ear was one of them. One of the medical visibility issues that he had was an ear pit. So there's a little dimple on the outside of one of his ears, and it means that the ear wasn't fully formed. So it came to a point and stopped forming, and then as he kept growing, that hole closed in, but it left a pit, so they automatically suspected that he might have hearing loss, and he does. He's profoundly deaf. Let's see, what else about me? I have 6 children. A couple of them have other disabilities, but we only have the one that's deaf. And my parents, I'm going to talk about them because they're great examples for medical models. My parents divorced when I was about 12, and they both remarried deaf people. I'll talk about that too. So I have lots of examples of deafness in my family and different ways they look at themselves, their own medical lens and their own cultural lens. I was an interpreter for the deaf for like 25 years. I still interpret, but rarely. I have my national certification, my state certifications. I specialize in medical and mental health appointments with deaf individuals. My favorite are therapy appointments. I feel like deaf people are very misunderstood and that they do not always have the opportunity to get the help that every other person does. It's amazing how many times you talk to a deaf person and they say, I couldn't find anyone who would get an interpreter, even though it's the law. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So my background is very, very heavy in that, and as I began to lose more and more hearing, the amount of jobs I could do started to narrow. I can still do medical mental health, one-on-one appointments, those are still my favorite, but stage interpreting, I can't hear unless I get it piped right into my ears, and not every area does that, right? So I started to look at different avenues. I've taught ASL before, I taught at KVCC and here at WMU, American Sign Language classes. I love to teach. And then somebody forwarded me the job opening at Disability Services for students at WMU. They were looking specifically for a deaf and hard of hearing accommodation specialist, and I felt like this is where I was supposed to be. So one of those aha moments in life. And so I applied and got the job. Most people don't know that we're under the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Really trying, a lot of schools, our office is part of the provost office. And so it's different here at Western that we're under that, really trying to be inclusive for all students. I think that's it about me. So we're going to talk about understanding the deaf world. I feel like it's very, very important to understand why people are deaf and why they feel the way they feel about themselves in order to provide the best services for them possible. We'll talk about best practices when working with deaf clients and patients as well. I mean, you could put students in there. I don't know how many of you are instructors / practitioner, so you can use that in both places. The use of assisted listening devices and speech reading, importance of videos and captioning, all media, and best practices when using an ASL interpreter. And if you have any questions, please just chime in. It's okay to interrupt me. I like that. So most people are familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is one of the biggest reasons, right? If you need a wheelchair ramp, you also have to provide an interpreter. It's equal access to language. That is where the interpreters come in. However, we're not a one-time thing. We're expensive. And so most people don't like that. They're going to see a client and they're probably going to see that client for free because they had to pay us. And that doesn't sit well with a lot of people. And so automatically you have a deaf person that walks in the door that's discriminated against because I don't like you because of how much I have to pay to serve you. And that's really unfair. That's a really unfair and I can tell you the sign, it's an unequal playing field. So the practitioner sort of has this authoritarian feel over this client, and usually it's a negative one. And I shouldn't say usually, some people are fantastic. But in my experience, by and large, they're not really happy that we're there. The other one is the Deaf Persons Act, and this applies to somebody who's hard of hearing who asks for accommodations. So Michigan passed the Deaf Persons Act, and this really flipped the playing field. So before they would say, yep, it's the Americans with Disabilities Act, but I decided we're going to type back and forth on my computer, and that's good enough for me. And so the deaf person didn't have a say in how they feel is their best communication mode. And the Deaf Persons Act totally flipped that. The deaf person has 100% of the say. You cannot tell the deaf person what they get or what's convenient for you. They get to tell you what's convenient for them, what's not convenient, what's the most effective communication. So what does a deaf person need to effectively communicate? That's really up to them. One deaf person, there's a million different modes of communication. Yes?
Around when was that Deaf Persons Act enacted?
I think it was 2007.
Okay, because it's fairly new that I've seen,
Yes.
a lot more interpreters out there.
Yeah, the other thing that happened with that, so you'll hear me talk about a lack of interpreters, this law actually had made it's good, it's a good law. We like that we're trying to do more to protect deaf people and bring up the quality of work of interpreters. However, something that the DODBHH, deaf, blind, hard of hearing division on deafness, with the state is they didn't make it easy for interpreters to stay in this field. There's no carryover. So a brand new interpreter that walks out of an interpreter training program says, okay, now what do? They say, well, go take the test. So you go take the test, you fail the test, go do more work. Okay, I'm gonna go do more work. You're not licensed, you can't do more work, go get certified. And there's no provisional, right? It's like asking a nursing student to go take the nursing exam without any prep courses. They need work, they need to go and practice. So I feel like we made a little bit of a mistake by not allowing some provisional work to work with a seasoned interpreter and try to get some of that done. So has really hindered our field, and so we lost a lot of interpreters because of that. Once it all fell out, which was, it took a while for that to come down. So understanding how a deaf person actually develops their preferences will help you understand where a deaf person is coming from. That's sort of where this came from. It's interesting that there is a huge emphasis on health behavior screening and medical health screenings, yet there is absolutely no tool in American Sign Language to do that screening, whether it's medical or mental health. Isn't that amazing? It's 2023. You would think that somebody has created something where you could have a person watch somebody signing fluently and asking them those general questions. And then they could either sign it back or they could type it in, right? There is, however, a pilot program, and it is called the Deaf Health Behavior Report. And they're trying to get that up and running. They're trying to work out the bugs and make that something that's more established, which is great. I hope that works. So obviously hearing loss is a range, right? You could have mild, moderate, severe, profound, and you could have several of those things. I have all of these. I'm mostly moderate to severe, but I have a little bit in the profound, and I have some that's mild. Depends on which pitch you're talking about, which tone you're talking about. I can no longer hear birds or frogs. If I put my hearing aids on, I have this giant swamp and forest in the back of my house. If I put my hearing aids on, I can hear them clear as day. Take my hearing aids off, I can't hear them at all, because I have tinnitus, which is the ringing in my ears. Tinnitus is actually the absence of hearing, so when you lose your hearing, usually you have the ringing. And it's that same frequency, that same tone. So to me, it just sounds like my tinnitus. So you have lots of variation with people's type of hearing loss when it comes to the medical view of that. Then there are cultural influences. Big D, deaf, when you see up here it's the slash D and small d, the big D means I'm culturally deaf. So even though I'm severely hard of hearing, I am culturally deaf. I sign with my husband at home. I prefer signing. It's easier for me to understand and talk to people. I can take my hearing aids out and not work so hard to figure things out. I was raised in that culture, so it's easy for me to adapt to that culture. Other people consider themselves the little d deaf. I'm medically deaf. I don't associate with the culture. I don't sign. That's not part of my life, and that is the difference. You can have hard of hearing individuals like me that can identify with either one. More of your latent deaf will not identify with deaf culture, right? Because they've lived their whole life as a hearing person. And most of your latent deaf, so individuals who lose their hearing late in life, don't want to get hearing aids. They don't want to admit that they're deaf, and yet they need it more than anybody. And they tend to get the wrong kind of hearing aids. So they get the over-the-counter ones because they're cheap, and then it amplifies everything, and it drives them nuts, and they take them off and throw them in a drawer, and they say hearing aids don't work for me. So there's a huge issue there. And then one of the biggest dilemmas is the family of origin and language acquisition, which are tied together. So these are some pictures of my family. This is my mom and dad when they got married. I love their glasses, and then my parents had 3 kids. I'm the baby. There's my sister in the purple dress, my brother in that green skirt, and then me and my dad. My dad was my guide. And deaf people are just like everyone else. They do everything like everybody else does. They just can't hear. My mom was severely hard of hearing. We'll talk about her in just a minute. So she would talk to us, but I signed with my dad. And so again, even as a little kid, I preferred to sign. I had hearing loss then, but I don't think I knew it. I just knew that I liked to sign. So, visible versus invisible. Deafness is a very invisible disability, like many disabilities, until it's not anymore, right? And then you have all kinds of issues. And we talked about the lack of interpreters, the cost of interpreters, and then suddenly people are discriminated against because now it's difficult. It's difficult for me to accommodate a deaf person, and I don't really want to do it. One of the worst things that you could say to me is, never mind, it wasn't important. What did you say? Don't worry about that. That's one of the worst things you can say to me. I want to know what you just said. Every single word is important. And it's a shame that we don't think about that somebody else, it may not be my fault that I didn't hear you, right? So there was a great research study in 2022, actually in China, and they studied the role of the community and the family and how they viewed the person's disability of deafness and how that impacted the deaf person. And so obviously, I mean, you might think this is a no-brainer, but if it was viewed negatively, that person, the deficit was extreme. It was extreme. Whereas if it was viewed positively, that deaf individual did very well and had very good outcomes educationally. So you can have the same 2 people, same hearing loss, and yet how they were viewed in their own nuclear family and in their small community changed the outcome of their life exponentially. Whoops, I apologize. There was a study, a very famous study, but it was a long time ago, Cummins, who is, I believe he's deaf, but he talked about the acquiring a first language is necessary to understand a second language. And in the United States, we don't emphasize that. In Sweden, they emphasize it. In lots of countries in Europe, they emphasize it. You need to have a base language to acquire a second language. But here in this country, the medical model is to give a child a cochlear implant. And we tell people that signing is a detriment to them. It is not a detriment. I'm a perfect example of that. I grew up signing. It did not affect my speech and language skills at all. And so it seems to make sense until you put deafness in there, until doctors start saying your child is going to be lonely and they're not going to have any friends and they're not going to be able to speak normal and they're not going to be able to hold down a job and they're going to be isolated. And all of those things are a possibility if they don't have language acquisition. Once you have language acquisition, you can learn a second language, you can learn English. So all of these things taken into consideration, you would think that we would promote signing with our children, deaf and hard of hearing children, but that is not what we do in this country. We sort of do both. We sign and voice at the same time, and it's like trying to speak English and French at the same time. So you mix up word order, you mix up syntax, they don't master one or the other. And that's where the confusion comes in. So this is my mom. She was born super premature, like 6 weeks or maybe I think it might have been 2 months. It was super premature. She wasn't supposed to live. They sent her home in this white box. It was a Red Cross box. You can see the Red Cross box sign on there. Yeah, I know, you guys are all like, what? Exactly, there was a big light in there. I'm pretty sure that's why she's blind, is from that light, because that's how they kept her warm, but they didn't do anything to protect her eyes. So my grandmother tells the story about how she got home and the doctor said, yeah, take her home, she's gonna die, we just don't know when. So feed her, change her, whatever. But this was 1942. There was no NICU. There was no, I actually have one of our daughters works in the NICU. I mean, a 6-week-old or 6-week early baby is like a no-brainer, unless they have something else going on with them. So my grandmother tells a story about how she would keep her in there and then she would take her out and she would hold her in the rocking chair, and then when she got really tired, she didn't like the box, so she would take the light out and put it over a dresser drawer with her hose, right? Pantyhose, nylons. Those are not even a thing anymore, I don't think. Anyway, she would put her in there and surround her so she was nice and whatever, and put her hand on there and she would sleep, and then when she would wake up, she would hold her again. She did that for 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, baby's still alive, she goes back to the doctor. Okay, she's alive. And so they did some rudimentary tests, and her brain is underdeveloped. She's blind in one eye. She's deaf. Well, they didn't know how deaf she was, but definitely major hearing loss and would continue to lose her hearing. Only had one set of teeth. I don't know, that was an odd thing. Her lungs are underdeveloped, like everything. So my grandmother said, how is she still alive? And he said, her heart's perfect. Heart's perfect. Her heart just kept beating. And so she has all kinds of other disabilities. And for a long time, if you were deaf, that's it. That was your disability. It didn't matter if you had other disabilities. Well, how do you navigate that? So my mom's her mentality stopped at about 6th grade. That's just where she is. She's still alive. She is, I don't even know, 81, something like that. She does have early signs of dementia, and she works with the PACE program. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the PACE program, but it's a great program that takes over all of her medical and like anything that she needs. And they have this daycare facility where she goes to do activities there twice a week, and she loves it. She is one of those kids that she was never signed with until she was like an adult. She learned to sign after the fact. But one of the things the concern that children, if they sign, they won't be able to use their auditory skills, that's actually false. There's some great research that talk about children who were signed to, hard of hearing children, who were only signed to in education. After 3 years They observed that their language their language development had improved. They had better shared experiences with other kids, shared play, social and emotional developmental gains that other kids who did not learn to sign that were also hard of hearing had. There's another research study that shows that behavior problems or lack of understanding don't come from auditory issues, they come from linguistic deprivation, language deprivation. And my mom definitely was an example of that. So my mom went to the PACE Center one day and she really hates using her walker. She doesn't like it. She doesn't like using her walker. So when she goes to her activities, she doesn't have an interpreter. She can speak very well because she didn't lose her hearing completely until later, after she learned how to talk. And so she comes home and she calls me on the video phone and she's signing to me and she's, I don't have to use my walker anymore. The nurse said, I don't have to use my walker anymore. And I was like, really? Wow, that's something, are you sure? Oh yeah. She said, I'm fine, I just need to practice. And I'm like, okay, something's not right. So I call my sister. My sister's the power of attorney and has really handled a lot of that with my mom. And my sister said, oh, no. I'll call him. So she calls him and the nurse says, I didn't tell her that. Okay, well, where did she get that? I have no idea. She said she wanted to not use her walker. But we said, well, you'd have to practice a lot more, before we can do that. And so my mom took that as, oh, if I practice, I don't have to use my walker. And so for my mom, you have to understand the mental disability and then address the deafness. It needed to be, no, you cannot use your walker, right? The head sign, no, you cannot, or no, you cannot walk without your walker. No, the answer is no. You're asking me this, no. But we can practice, but not on your own. That had to be the overpowering, but I'm sure it was something like, oh, we can practice, right? And then I'm head nodding. And what my head nod says is, oh, of course you can go without your walker. We do that. Our hearing culture lets us nod because that's a nice way of saying no. And so we have to be really, really careful about those cross messages. Emergency alarms. My mom would set off the emergency alarm in her apartment and have no idea. And they would get so mad at her. Why didn't you call us? Okay, number one, she can't call you. She's deaf. And number two, she can't hear the emergency alarm. So hook up a light to the emergency alarm. So it's been very interesting about some of those. So if you're in that kind of field, those are really great things to bring up. This is my dad, his second birthday, and then this is a picture of him working at Mead Paper Company. He worked at Mead Paper Company for like 41 or 42 years. I don't remember. He actually came to Western Michigan University. There were no laws, so he didn't have an interpreter. He just tried to understand what people were saying, and instructors would write on the board, and he would just figure it out. After 2 years, he was like, well, I have no idea what anybody's saying anymore, and I couldn't pass any of my classes anymore. He wanted to be an architect. And so they said, well, you couldn't pass any of your classes, so we just graduate you with your printing degree and send you out into the world. And so he was like, okay, my dad's got one of the best attitudes I've ever seen in my life. He's just happy no matter what. And he was at Mead when a safety switch failed and he slipped and the press came down and flattened all of the fingers on his dominant right hand. So he's deaf. He's got no fingers on his hand now. So he just has one hand. Last fall, my dad had a stroke and was rushed to the emergency room. And the first thing they did is they took this video screen to get a video interpreter on there to see my dad. First of all, it's a horrible idea. So they get these in there, and I understand there's going to be an interpreter. They're waiting for another interpreter to come in, and I'm saying, I need you to get the interpreter here now. And no one in the room knows that there's an interpreter, a staff interpreter who schedules interpreters and covers appointments herself. And I'm telling them this because I know. It's Valerie Boyer, Bronson Hospital. Please call her. And they're like, we don't know who you're talking about. And I'm like, you need to find someone because this isn't working. This interpreter can't, there's 10 people in this room, and I appreciate everything you're doing for my dad, but that one interpreter who's on a video screen cannot see any of them and does not know who's talking and who's talking to who and who's talking to my dad. So I'm interpreting, and I'm worried about my dad's life, and he can't move the one good hand he has. It affected that side of his body. So finally, somebody walked in, I can't remember, I wish I could remember what his badge said. He was like he was the guy, right? And I'm like, oh, hey, you're the person, manager maybe? I don't know. And I said, you're the guy I need to talk to. You have a staff interpreter, her name is Valerie Boyer, and I need you to call her and I need you to get a real interpreter in, not a real, alive. It was like, so I think I might have said that. I'm like, sorry interpreter, I'm not trying to be offensive. And he was like, absolutely, I can see the chaos. Now in between, they're still working on my dad, and they've taken him and they bring him back, and they're gonna give him the big blood thinner, shot, and he's gotta know what the side effects are. And so I just pushed the screen away and explained to my dad, these are the side effects. You could die. This could happen. It may not work. Do you wanna do this? And then he looks at me and says, what do you want me to do? And I said, you take it right now. And he's like, okay. So luckily, he's got most of it back. It's not 100%, but he's able to live independent again and drive, and he lives on his own. But another interesting story is, right, those of you who are in the medical field after a stroke and you receive this medication, they have to, I didn't know this, so I'm in the room with them, and every hour, or every 20 minutes or something to start with, and then it's every hour, and then every 2 hours, they come and ask the same darn questions. And boy, was my dad getting irritated. But in my true dad style of humor, he would start joking about things. And I'm like, Dad, you can't joke with them. They really need to know that you remember what your name is. So he'd be like, okay. So then he'd start saying, because he can't sign anything, right? He's using his own voice. The interpreter can't understand his voice, but I can. So I'm there voicing for him. So then he starts spelling, what's your name? R-I-C-H. And I'm like, oh my gosh, my dad. And he's trying to be funny. He's trying to lighten the mood. At one point, though, they came in to show him pictures. Tell me what this is. Well, there wasn't a sign for it. There's no sign for, I can't remember what it is. There's some examples, but like a weapon. There is no sign for weapon. I have to give you examples of what a weapon is. I fingerspell weapon, and then I give you examples. So he couldn't even sign. At that point, he was able to move a little bit. So he was starting to sign, but there's no sign for that. So he's like, so he tries to voice a weapon. Well, that's not a very good question for a deaf person if they're trying to sign back to you. And then they showed him a picture of a cell phone. Well, my dad has called a cell phone a pager since the day they phased out his pager, okay? Deaf people like their technology. So they say, what's this? And what does he say? Pager. And they all look around, and I'm like, he calls it that all the time. He calls it that all the time. He'll say, I can't find my pager, or I tried to call you on my pager. And so they all got a kick out of that. But important to know those kind of things when it comes to deafness. And then the last thing about my dad is working with a social worker to transition him home. Well, he only lost the mobility in his left hand, so the insurance says he can go home. Okay, he can't wipe his own rear end. He can't cook. He can't do his laundry. He can't hold on to anything to walk. Like, he doesn't have fingers on the other hand. So we literally had to battle with people and requested a new social worker in order to get his needs met. And I don't want to be that person, but it's like, okay, he only has one hand, so you have to make that clear to somebody else. This is my stepdad, who has passed away. He lost all of his hearing to tinnitus. They don't really know why. He lost it when he was about 8 years old. The ringing in his ears just got louder and louder and louder and louder, and one day he just couldn't hear anymore at all. He had great speech, so people would think he could hear automatically and would fight. Sometimes they would say, well, you don't need an interpreter because you hear fine. And he's like, no, I don't. And it was just terrible. So he had dementia and went into facility care, of course, during COVID, and was completely isolated, completely. He couldn't even talk to anybody because nobody could talk to him. And so we begged and bartered and, tried to cite isolation and, all of these things. And finally, my sister, who was the power of attorney, was able to go in because she had the power of attorney, and is allowed to go and check on, make sure his living area was suitable. So she would use that as an excuse and then go visit with him. But very, very detrimental to individuals. This is my stepmom, who also passed away. My dad is still alive, he's 88, yeah, he's still a spitfire and really fun. But my stepmom, she was a deaf child of deaf parents, and her mom's side all deaf. Everybody on her mom's side was all deaf. So she did learn ASL as her first language, and she was a brilliant individual. My dad is brilliant too, but as far as the English language, she was a brilliant individual. Could read fluently, was very savvy, could navigate both cultures very easy, could cross competent in both cultures. She was an amazing, amazing woman. And there is lots of research that shows that when you have native signing in the home, that your educational outcomes and your social outcomes, your friendships, all of those things are much higher developed than children who do not have signing in the home. And native signing, right? Experienced signing, not just a few words. And sometimes it takes parents a little while to get there, but there have been parents who have learned and adapted. So my stepmom's story, she was in the hospital for a surgery. I can't remember what surgery it was. And a nurse, probably a PCA, came in and handed her something and mouthed something, blah, 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 blah. And so my stepmom's like, what? Well, the PCA had all gold teeth. Every tooth was gold. And so she said, all, like her mouth glittered, you know, and I was like, what's going on? And so she left. And so my mom says, I'm looking at this going, okay. So and I think the PCA pointed at the bathroom. So she's, okay, I go in the bathroom and I'm like, okay, am I supposed to drink it? Am I supposed to, like, what am I supposed to do with this? So she's like, okay, well, so she takes a little sip of it and then spits it out. It's soap. It's soap. She wanted her to wash the area that she's gonna have surgery on, I think. She thinks. So she was like, I washed the area, but then, you know, when they came back, I just nodded. Okay, you know, and then I prayed I wouldn't get infected or something. You know, I don't know what I was supposed to do with that. So important to always make sure people know what you're talking about. And that comes from asking for a response back, not just a yes or no. Can you tell me, okay, read back to me what you're supposed to do. That should be a standard for every person, not just a deaf or hard of hearing person. But even hearing people will be like, oh yeah, I get it. And then you walk away and you're like, I don't know. I hope they wrote that down somewhere. So I say all these negative things, right? You're all these negative about being deaf. Deafness is cool. My culture is awesome. It's amazing. It's vibrant. The facial expressions and the just the language that exudes off of somebody is beautiful. And my stepmom and my dad met, and we call it the love boat. My dad will always say that he met on the love boat. They have cruise ships that they will book that's 100% deaf people. And then they hire interpreters to come in so they can interpret the entertainment or anything else they need, the wait staff, anything. And so they, at that particular cruise ship, I've never been on a cruise, but it's where they had the assigned seating for dinner. And my dad and my stepmom were assigned to the same table. And she lived only an hour and a half away. So my dad was here in Kalamazoo, and she lived in Elkhart, Indiana, and so they started dating and they got married, and she was just an absolute delight in my life. So what questions could be helpful? Some things to know to ask a deaf person, maybe where did you go to school? Because if they went to a deaf school, their ASL language is probably very solid. So what they didn't get at home, they probably got at the deaf school. So they probably have a really good understanding of ASL, and they might have a better understanding of English. Did your parents sign? How'd you communicate with your parents? You know, some of this is harder in a medical setting. It's a little easier to do in a mental health setting when you're talking to somebody about their history. And how about your friends? Do you have deaf friends? Do you have hearing friends? My son in particular has other disabilities. He's completely isolated. We're his whole people, and I worry about him because I don't think he's mostly okay. So it's important to understand, what their surroundings are like, because that clues you into the background of what they have and what their language may be. So here's some things to know. You should get the attention of the person speaking. If the individual doesn't respond to the spoken name, a tap on the shoulder or another visual signal is appropriate. So tapping on the shoulder is 100% okay. A student a deaf person in a waiting room, you know, like I can't tell you how great it would be if I had somebody came out and like waved at the person. Hey, you know, that'd be so great instead of standing in the doorway calling Sherry, Sherry, and then the interpreter has to like get my attention and then spell my name and then, okay, let's go back. And I get, you may not know what they look like, but waving is definitely appropriate. Flashing the lights is also appropriate, but it might freak out everybody else in the room. So it's probably not recommended. Deaf people use that all the time. When they have deaf gatherings and it's time to like start the food, they'll flash the lights and everybody will stop their conversation and look to see what's going on. Providing a written outline of the main topics, salient points, things to remember, etc. Use the bullet points in very direct language. You know, like if it's a time frame thing. At 1 o'clock, you need to take this medication. At 2 o'clock, take this medication. Not all of the English little words. Make sure that you take your medication at 1 o'clock every day. No, that you like every day. This is what you do. It's very short and to the point. Speak clearly and at a normal pace. Don't yell or over-enunciate. What happens when I over-enunciate is that my lips go like this and I have no idea what you're saying anymore. Like, whoa. So you just talk at a normal pace. Try not to cover your mouth or look around. Like what I'm doing right now, looking back and forth, would be very difficult to read my lips because I keep looking away. Avoid standing in front of a light source. So if I was standing over there, it sort of blacks me out. So if there is a window, it's always suggested that you cover the window or move yourself away from the window so they can see your face and your facial expressions. If you need to repeat, like especially for a hard of hearing person, try to use a different phrase. So what I'm trying to do is put a puzzle together. And when you say something and I missed it, it's usually, I didn't miss the whole thing. It's like I missed something in there. So if you rephrase it, you've now said it differently and I have 2 ways to put my puzzle together and then I've got it. I mean, usually it's just one. I know you don't know what word it is I missed. I don't know what the word is either, so I can't ask for that. So rephrasing it, even if it's in like, hey, tomorrow, do you want to go to the store? Just reword it. Hey, I want to go to the store. Do you want to come with me tomorrow? It just might be that simple, that some of the syllables stuck together sound weird. Use visual aids. Oh my gosh, a picture worth 1,000 words, 100%. Can you show them a YouTube video about where their gallbladder is? Can you show them what a sinus surgery looks like? Can you show them what somebody looks like when they're depressed, or somebody that talks about what depression feels like? Those are all really impactful ways to show a deaf person that may never have that incidental learning, especially in their home, right? They don't get any of that if they were not signed with. And incidental learning is huge, right? You hear stuff on the radio, you hear your classmates, you hear your parents argue and make up. Deaf children don't get any of that if there's no signing in the home. Use open-ended questions. That's what I talked about, to make sure you get to make sure you have clear understanding. Ask them to repeat back your instructions instead of just yes or no, because we call it the deaf nod. They'd be like, you understand? Yep. Because I am not going to look stupid and say that I don't understand. Because hearing people understand, deaf people don't understand. That's something that's ingrained. Only 30% of English speech sounds are visible on the mouth under the best conditions. So that's not a lot. So speech reading is really not the best. So I'm just going to, I have a video. Let's see if I can flip over here.
When I was really young, probably kindergarten or first grade, I have a much older brother, and we'd go out to recess, and there was this older guy who might have been in like 5th or 6th grade that always used to pick on.
Today we went to a high school and
I was posing for a picture with all of my girlfriends, Can you read my lips?
Can you read?
Can you read my lips? Can you read her lips?
My Clementine loves bread. She's still alive.
Can you read his lips?
I have 2 dogs, one boxer.
I am dead. But my word is a healing word. I rely on the visual, not the auditory. The word that reading implies reading, like reading a book.
Whose text is legible and clear.
But the human face isn't a book, and the reading isn't reading. People mumble, people talk fast enough loudly, people have facial hair like orangutans, lips like sphincters, people cover their mouths, people have accents. But real conversations don't take place in a studio. I'm putting together a lesson without all the pieces. I look in a new mouth and try to grasp with one sense information intended for another. There have been times when I've questioned why I even tried to begin to wade through this storm when I could just use sign language. Some deaf people choose to do just that. It's like a different world, a world filled with rich expression and culture. When people sign, they come alive, but I know I want those words. Communication is never a given.
Tuesday, I woke up, had a
She
breakfast.
just pulled my dress down.
When I was little, my family was like,
Wednesday was hit him in the face. That was like the last thing that
Guinea pig.
I'm trying to learn how to skate. I only cried twice.
But when the reading works, what I'm focused on warm, nurturing things and launch into a conversation, something clicks. Right then, I'm feeling something extraordinary.
There is nothing
I know.
else. I was reading
connection.
All right, I think I didn't stop that, so. I love that video because what you're hearing is what other deaf people might hear. So those pitches and tones in there are different forms of tinnitus. They all sound different. Every individual hears something different. I told you what mine was like frogs or birds. That's what I hear all the time. That one note that just keeps static, that just keeps playing. And some of you might have that. You might play a fan at night, because it bothers you. So my husband has a little bit of that, so we have a fan going. It's not for me, it's for him, because he doesn't like hearing it. So caption videos, you can see on there, when the caption started to fade away, you get nothing. Right? You can't understand what's going on. There's lots of evidence-based research that supports using caption media and how it benefits, dramatically benefits, the ability to retain and recall information from video. So that's for anyone, not just deaf or hard of hearing individuals, but it could be for second language, English as a second language learners, students with ADD or ADHD or individuals with ADD, learning disabilities, auditory processing, and more. It's really, really beneficial, and it's usually difficult for people to learn how to use it at first because that's where you focus 100% of your time is on the closed captioning. Then after you get adjusted to it, I don't know how many of you have anybody use closed captioning in here? No, sometimes? Okay. So after a while you get used to it, you can watch a movie and the captions at the same time, but it is a skill that you develop. So in our last couple of minutes, talked about ASL interpreters. We talked about the extreme shortage of interpreters. During COVID, we lost even more interpreters. So people found other ways to work at home. People were not wanting to go out into the field and expose themselves. Medical and mental health field was very limited. Anyway, so it was difficult. I think one of the biggest things I would want a practitioner or an instructor to sort of understand is that interpreters are your interpreters, not just the deaf person's interpreter. They're there for you, to communicate what you need to do your job. Meaning to have you be able to do the best job possible for that client. They are a colleague, they're not a deaf person's aide. They might have conversations with them because, again, remember their isolation, they're excited to talk to somebody. So you might see them chatting or something, but they're not your judge, they're not your jury, they're not there to evaluate your skill, they're there to do their job. Their expertise is in language and trying to best fit the needs of that client. Every deaf person we meet is different. So trying to adjust how I sign to make sure you're understood to that client is my focus. That's my expertise. That's what I'm working on the whole time. If you hear an interpreter ask you, could you explain what diverticulitis means or something? Or can you explain the difference between the flu and a cold? And I've had people look at me and go, seriously, you don't know? Yeah, I know, but your deaf client doesn't. So I'm trying to, in a nice way, get you to expand that information because the deaf client is looking at me like, what? And so that's a signal to me that there has been a breakdown in communication. So I'm going to ask for clarification. I will also ask for clarification for you for you to spell medication names. Always spell medication names. I have done those. I've taken medical classes so I can learn about medications and common medications and whatever, but if you're not using it day in and day out, you don't remember. And so spelling is important. Any job more than an hour and a half, it's typically 2 hours in the medical mental health field, more than 2 hours, or difficult content requires 2 interpreters. The hour and a half is really more for educational. Sometimes an instructor will talk straight for an hour and 15 minutes and it's on, I don't know, something a really tough subject. And studies show that our brains break down after about 15 or 20 minutes in trying to translate that information. And so we have to switch on and off to make sure that that is interpreted appropriately. We have a really strict code of professional conduct. We are not allowed to share any information. So I would do a really horrible mental health job and go home and try to not have vicarious trauma, right? Do all the good self-care things, but not be able to talk to somebody. So I would have to try to find my safe person, create a safe person who I know I can trust, is not going to tell anybody else any information, so I can just unburden some of that stuff. When you go from appointment to appointment to appointment to appointment, it can be a lot. And you also see, for me, it was hard to see the oppression of the deaf individual. That was harder for me to accept than some of the burdens that the deaf person was going through. When they get cancer, I feel like I got cancer, right? I'm giving this message and I'm accepting the message. Both are coming through me. If you say it, I sign it. If they sign it, I say it. If you're having a segue with a nurse, or having a side conversation, if I can hear it, a hearing client would hear it, so I'm going to sign it. All of that information is important. Try to always make eye contact with the deaf client. Ignore the interpreter. Try to ignore the interpreter's even there. And avoid saying, tell him. Hey, can you tell him? Well, then I'm going to sign, hey, can you tell him? And the deaf person's like, who am I supposed to tell? Like, what am I telling? In a group setting, if there's a group setting, try to have people speak one at a time. It's really difficult for an interpreter to be able to decide which message is the most important for me to interpret. If you're in a small, if the deaf person is sitting in that chair, hey Betty, can you come be my example? If a deaf person is sitting in this chair and you're the practitioner or a teacher, sometimes you're afraid to walk in between, and that's okay. Oh, okay, yeah, that's great. So if Thank you. So you can just walk right in between because I'm signing and I can pause for just a second and then keep going. You're already gone. But sometimes people make a big deal. They're like, okay, or they try to like, that's my favorite. I love that one. You don't have to do any of that. That actually takes more time and more whatever. In a practitioner's office, I'm going to have you come be up here with me now. So now you're the practitioner. If this is a mental health appointment, you're going to look at the client and I'm going to shadow you. I'm going to be about right here. And this is important because the deaf person just can look from her face to my face, just right back and forth. So the effect is coming from the practitioner, not from me. Medical doctors don't like me anywhere near them. They keep trying to roll away, and I keep following them. And then if you can be the patient again, when it's something that's really private, okay? Like if they were a male, biological male, and I'm a female, and it's weird because they need to have their private area checked, I just simply move up here, right? And then I sign, and I don't see anything that's happening below the table. Or I say, would you like me to step out of the room? And then I say, give them all the, or female, doesn't even matter if it's female. They might not want, I don't want somebody in there with my stuff hanging out, you know, like I want you to go out. So I'll give all the instructions. Okay, I'm gonna step outside, let me know when you're done. And then I express to the doctor, don't say anything when I'm not in here. And then I go out, then they open the door and I come back in and then we go back on. So important that the deaf person makes those decisions. Nodding, just like you guys are doing, you're nodding, you're like, okay, I'm with you. It doesn't always mean I understand. So if you ask a deaf person a question, you know, do you, like my dad, do you want this? You know, I'm signing to my dad, do you understand? This could happen, and my dad's going, okay, and the doctor's like, okay, he's saying yes. No, he's not. We're not there yet. Okay, so understand that sometimes they are nodding because they're just accepting the affirmation of signing. Yep, I'm with you. Processing time for an interpreter means allowing time for thought before asking an answer. So because ASL is a French derivative, it's not English, it's actually based off the French language, I wait for you to start talking, and then I'm gonna start processing, how do I change this? And then I'm gonna put it out there. So I'm gonna be a little behind you by the time you're done. So understand that sometimes you just look over, okay, now the interpreter's done, and now we can continue forward. If you are gonna show something, try not to point at something and talk at the same time, because what happens? They follow your finger, and now they're not looking at the interpreter anymore, right? Or looking at your face, so they can't see what you're talking about. So what you should do is explain, then let me show you this video, or this picture, or the diagram, look at this, and then, okay, you good? We're good, and then I can explain it again, or review, or whatever. That would be a best practice. That was a lot of information. Questions? Yes?
I'm close to a family whose children have varying levels of deafness.
Okay.
And they
You
have,
mean different family members have different levels?
the children in the family.
Okay.
Yeah, in the family, from profound to less so.
Okay.
And they chose not to learn sign language.
Okay.
And which was really tough, because I would swim with these little children, and you know, it's like, how do you yell, be careful, don't do that? How do you communicate? It was dangerous.
Sure.
But so where did it start, this anti-sign language movement? Do you have any information of how that happened?
Yeah, Alexander Graham Bell was a huge proponent of absolutely no signing. And interestingly enough, his wife was severely hard of hearing. And he felt it wasn't normal. These people that are hands slapping and moving around is not normal. It's not normal, so we shouldn't do that. And so the first movement that came over, there was a man, Gallaudet, which is where Gallaudet College came from, if you're familiar with that. He thought, he met a girl and understood that even though she didn't have language, she was super smart. Alice Cogswell was her name. And he was like, there's gotta be a way to educate her. There's gotta be something. So he started looking around, and France had a program. So he took the boat, right? Because it was a really long time ago. That's how you got there, was a boat. And went over and convinced Laurent Claire to come over to the United States and help him establish a school. And so Martha's Vineyard actually was all deaf at one point, which is kind of an interesting historical. But anyway, they came here, they established a school and started teaching children in sign language. And Gallaudet was amazed by that. And then somewhere in there, a medical model started to pop up that when you sign with children, you know, that it's a detriment to their speech, which I never could understand. Because if any one of you right now, or if all of you, lost your hearing completely, it has nothing to do with your brain.
Right.
You know, you don't have brain damage suddenly. You know, they're not linked. And so, anyway, he was a huge proponent. Alexander Graham Bell was a huge proponent of the oral and aural philosophy. And he had money, right? And where there's money, people follow. And so, and you all know, you can make research look however you want. And so they got people to think that this is a bad thing. So, and we're fighting to get it back still in our schools, yeah.
The thing about what Joanna's saying, first of all, thank you for that, so very informative.
Thank you.
My grandmother is deaf and my mother is deaf.
Oh, yeah.
And only recently actually taken on the identity because they started hearing first. And it was only, I think he's 45 now, it was only a couple years ago when he first said that, I was like, wait, what? So you're like, but he takes on his hearing aids, he doesn't hear anything. And to Dan's point is when he was little, you know, they went to Constance Brown, they told him what was wrong, he couldn't hardly speak, he wasn't listening to the vacuum. When he was a baby, my mom knew something was wrong. But they said, well, once he got hearing aids, oh, he can read lips, he can hear, so he never signed. And hearing aids today is kind of mind-blowing because it's like, it was a detriment that my family didn't learn sign language. He was socially isolated, suicidal at some point, you know, cognitively, and emotional intelligence, a lot of things I really didn't have them. So hearing that, it was like, okay. So I'm trying to absorb that.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, well,
First of all,
I got a little emotional when you were talking.
Yeah, I get really, I'm like, had to choke back stuff, especially about my son, because he, you know, he didn't choose that life. He was a drug baby, and we adopted him, and I thought it was gonna be great. We're gonna get this deaf kid, he's gonna go to Gallaudet, and he's like farthest from that. You know, like he's got all these emotional impairments, and was suicidal for a while, and yeah.
So when you said that earlier about your son, I was like, gosh, something wrong when he was little. So, thank you, it's kind of validating. The other piece you just mentioned, I wanted to ask, as educators, we always talk about person-first language. And so we always say, you know, individuals with, or, you know, those kind of things. So person-first language, and so to hear that person is kind of, I'm trying to grapple how to educate.
Thank you for the question. Deaf people are a little bit weird. We're just proud of the fact that we're deaf. And hearing loss comes across as like I didn't lose anything. So, I mean, I vacillate. You know, I'm like, I have hearing loss. I have hearing, I'm hard of hearing. I don't like any of it. So deaf just seems to fit. And so in my experience, people that are deaf are fine with a deaf individual. They are deaf. I've never heard a deaf person being offended. But typically, if you say hearing impaired, that's not a great one because they don't like being impaired. They feel, I'm not impaired, I just can't hear. It's a really interesting question because technically, by the law, right, there's a disability, and yet a deaf person does not feel disabled. I think one of the best ways I've heard it is a deaf person said, I don't feel disabled until somebody else treats me like I am. And I think that's probably a good statement for anybody who's disabled. But, yeah. So it's a very interesting question. Yes?
I teach my grandkids how to sign, and they can hear just fine.
Yeah.
My granddaughter's blind, she's one that's not interested anymore.
Yeah.
And she's that's her favorite.
More is always the favorite. Of course.
My son's 20, and we taught him, he had like 30 signs. And because he didn't want to talk to people, he didn't want to learn things until he went to the corner and learned it by himself. And he was you know, but signing gave him the confidence to talk. And I just don't understand this thing. My stepdad, he was an orphan, and he was in an orphanage, and he couldn't hear, but he could read lips. But he didn't understand why I was teaching my kids sign language. You know,
It's interesting, yeah.
Almost 80, so.
Sure.
Yeah, so
It is very interesting. I mean, what people adapt to as their own norm, their own normal, it's difficult for them to think outside of that. And with deafness, it is very broad. What people use from one end to the other is just a huge spectrum. And so it is interesting that you would have that. I have 4 grandkids, and we've signed with all of them because we never knew if the hereditary loss is going to pop up with any of them. So my son's a police officer, but right now his hearing is, good enough to be on the force, and he's not aided yet, he doesn't have hearing aids yet. I don't like that word either, but you get used to things when I have this assisted listening device, and it's awesome. I can hear things I wouldn't hear normally. So I guess I am disabled because an average person doesn't need one of these. But I think attitude is everything, I'm okay with that. So people are always like, oh, you still interpret? How do you do that? And I'm like, well, I have these hearing aids and I can hear. So it's pretty cool. Any other questions? Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your interest in the topic and your connections. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So you all please take a picture of this QR code and give us some feedback. The CD's information is there as well. As I said before, let us know how you feel about belonging here in the college. We're interested in that. This has been a phenomenal series. We've got one more left next week. We hope that you'll come back. Bring your students, bring your co-workers, other faculty. Will be dealing with the deaf community again. And this time we're hopefully going to have different scenarios that you all can actually go through. And one of our faculty members, Tanya Timmerman, will be leading that. Yes, ma'am.
That QR code goes to the equine therapy course.
Oh,
the questions are.
I pulled it up earlier, really? It worked when I pulled it up. I have, you did? Hang on one second, I have the.
Did it work for somebody else? Yeah.
If I the questions are.
Did it work for you?
I looked at the questions and I have equine and horse human questions. Yeah. So the title.
But it worked for some other.
Right. The title is correct of the survey, but the questions, the items are.
Does anybody need the actual link then? I have the link here.
Yeah. Joshua gave us that, I'm sorry, thank you so much for trying it that way.
I swear I tested it out and it worked, but I didn't. No equine questions.
I love the fact that we can do all of this on our phone.
Yeah, so much easier. Also, this is a great building.
If you all want some pizza to go.
Yeah, pizza, get some pizza.
Yeah, Mary.
Oh, yeah.
If you want to.
Okay, it's my job. So, okay.
It's pretty cool. If you go to 410, it's forward, it overlooks all of Bayfield.
Oh, is that,
Thank you.
at the end?